This video is a sequel to another video on the exact same subject. You do not have to watch that video to watch this video, and you could even watch it afterwards. But just in case you're curious, here's a link. In that video, I talked about how Splatoon, when you break it down to its core mechanics, is essentially a perfect game. The two main game mechanics of platforming and shooting, or inking, are perfectly balanced. You spend an equal amount of time platforming as you do shooting. And that is because there are many different ways that those two core mechanics work. You have platforming as a kid, and you have platforming as a squid. You have shooting or splatting an opponent, and you have splatting the ground. And those two mechanics work so perfectly together because the game is not centered around merely killing the enemy, but it's centered around the ink itself. The way a single game element, the ink, manages to unite every single mechanic so perfectly is unbelievable. But not only that, but the game is a masterpiece in game essence. Game essence is the balance between risk versus reward, which is essentially what makes most games fun. I definitely recommend going and checking out Masahiro Sakurai's full video on the subject. But to summarize, game essence is essentially the fun of managing risks or rewards, and strategy, which is the same thing from a different perspective, is how you manage the risks or rewards. And Splatoon does both of those things perfectly. The essence is the fact that there is a risk state and a safe state. When you're in kid form, you are visible to the enemy, which puts you at risk yourself of being splatted. But at the same time, it allows you to put out ink yourself, to splat the enemy or to paint the ground. But you run out of that ink, which forces you into the safe state. In the safe state, you are perfectly hidden as long as you're in ink. But you can't put down ink when you're in that state, which means the risk continues to grow larger the longer you stay there, because the enemy is still putting down their ink, which takes away the places that you have to hide. So the game has both a natural way to force you into the safe state and force you out of it, because you can't hide until you first take a risk. And then on top of all of that, the way you win a match is not the most kills, but by inking the most turf, which means the strategy is not only focused on splats, but is focused mostly on shooting the weapon. And since some weapons are better at splatting opponents than others, and some are more suited to inking a lot of turf, there is still a lot of strategy to it. But because the game is focused on inked turf instead of splats, the entry barrier is extremely low for this kind of a game. You don't have to be skilled at all in coordinating with your team or splatting an opponent. Merely shooting the weapon itself helps contribute to a win. That is all a very basic explanation for why Splatoon is such a perfect game, and it's really only focused around Turf War. Turf War is the main game mode of Splatoon. It has been present in all three games, and Splatoon 3 has pretty much perfected it. And other than some map layouts, and the way Nintendo handles online, there is essentially nothing wrong with it. It is a perfect game. But there are other game modes in Splatoon. I didn't get to talk about them in the last video due to a few reasons, but I was really hoping to make a part 2, and since it was requested in the comments, here we are. The first game mode I'm going to look at is Salmon Run. Splatoon 3 has kind of turned it into the second biggest mode. It was not present in the first game, and it was included kind of just like a bonus mode in Splatoon 2. It was not available to play whenever you wanted to, but only at certain times. But it is available to play whenever you want to in Splatoon 3, and they really treat it like Turf War. They've added a good bit of new stuff to it, and they give it a special event every so often just like Splatfests, although not quite as fun. But there are some major differences between Salmon Run and Turf War. In my opinion, there are really only two differences that are responsible for changing the game entirely. The first one is the enemy is not an opposing team, but are salmonids, which are AI controlled, and the goal is not to ink the most turf, but is to collect a certain number of golden eggs. And since golden eggs are only dropped by certain salmonids, you could say the main goal this time is the most splats, which is the complete opposite of Turf War. But that's not entirely true because you still have to take those golden eggs to the container in the middle. Other than those two differences, the map is much more wide and more open, which at the same time does and doesn't really change too much. You do not know which weapon you are going to be using. It gets handed to you randomly at the start of each round. And at least for me, I kind of enjoy that. It gives me a chance to test out weapons that I really wouldn't try otherwise. There is a system to how it randomly hands out the weapons, but I think it could be balanced a little bit more. Some of the weapons are way overpowered and some of them don't really do anything. It is a unique idea to have the weapons randomized. It certainly does make each round feel a little bit different. It helps to stop it from feeling repetitive, but I don't think the maps being different or the weapon randomizer change all that much. Everything that makes Salmon Run feel like Salmon Run is down to the enemy and the golden eggs. So let's look at what the risk-reward balance of Salmon Run is. Obviously, beating a run and getting all the rewards from that is the reward, but I'd argue that every individual egg that you get and put into the basket is a reward of its own. In order to get a golden egg, you have to go out and find and defeat a boss salmonid. Having boss in the name makes it sound like they'd be a little rare, but they're extremely common. The salmonids themselves are a very unique idea. They're another species of sea creatures that have a large history and a lot of lore. They have put into the game a real reason for why they're coming onto the land, why they're carrying golden eggs, and why we're going to get them. But I won't spoil any of that for you. In Turf War, like we discussed, you can be a help to your team by merely shooting the weapon. In Salmon Run, it's not quite as simple, since the goal is not the most inked turf, but to collect golden eggs, and since golden eggs come from splatting enemies, you do have to focus more on where your ink is going. You still have to focus on where you're inking in Turf War, but it's a little bit different in Salmon Run. Because the salmonids come at you in a wave other than one at a time or two at a time, they can overwhelm you very quickly if you're not focusing on shooting them. But because they're not able to hide in the ink or shoot a weapon, they're much easier to deal with in higher numbers. And then we have the boss salmonids, which could be my favorite enemies in Splatoon. Each one has a very unique design and a very unique mechanic. You can't defeat them by simply shooting at them, you have to find their weakness and exploit it. When you defeat one, they drop some golden eggs, and you have to take those golden eggs back to the container on the map. But you're only allowed to carry one at a time, which is where teamwork becomes such a big part of Salmon Run. This is one of the very few games I can think of where you work together as a team, but you're not going against an opposing team, you're just going against the game. When you think about it, it is kind of weird. Salmon Run could almost work as a solo mode, but just the inclusion of teamwork makes it more fun. And the more you coordinate as a team, the more and more golden eggs you're able to collect. If everyone's spread up across the map, you wouldn't end up with many golden eggs. But this game has been designed to where just shooting in the general direction that your teammates are shooting, as long as they're shooting somewhere they're supposed to be, will end up making more of a difference than if everyone went out on their own. Compared to Turf War, I would say the balance between platforming and shooting is a little bit different. You spend more time shooting than you do platforming. And I would say that's the biggest thing that makes Salmon Run feel different than Turf War. It provides you with a different way to use those core mechanics where they still work perfectly together, even if they're not balanced. But Salmon Run, I think, still has the most room for improvement out of everything that Splatoon has to offer. They have implemented many ways to make each round feel different. The water level will change, the egg basket will change position, the weapons are randomized, the boss salmons are randomized, and some maps even have unique mechanics like rocket launchers. But Salmon Run still starts to feel a little repetitive if you've played it long enough. It is still a geniusly designed mode with a perfect concept and core, and I think it is an amazing inverse to normal Turf War. The next mode in Splatoon is technically 4 modes, but they all fall under the category of Anarchy battles. We have Splat Zones, Tower Control, Rainmaker, and Clam Blitz, and each one puts its own unique twist into traditional Turf War. Splat Zones is the most similar to traditional Turf War, but instead of the goal being to ink the whole map, you're supposed to ink this little square, the Splat Zone itself. And since the whole game's focus is now on this central point, that means the players are not spread out as much as they normally are, but are condensed down to its general area. So now that the goal is to ink a specific part of the map, and every player will be around that point, you can no longer help your team as much by just merely shooting the weapon. And that is going to be the case with every other Anarchy mode. They increase the skill level just a little bit. You now have to focus on where exactly your ink is going, and the location of the enemy team and your own team. Teamwork becomes a much bigger role in these modes, because you're less likely to have a simple 1v1. Everyone is going to be in the same central area, which means it's much easier to run into multiple enemies at a time. But Splat Zones, along with every other mode, have ways to balance the skill level out. If the winner of Splat Zones was whoever had the most ink in the Splat Zone by the end of the round, the game mode would be complete garbage. You would just wait around with your team until the last second, and then go full force on the Splat Zone, leaving the enemy team with no time to react or recover. But the game has been designed to where the winner is whoever's been able to hold the Splat Zone the longest, which means every second you don't have that ground splatted, the enemy team grows closer to winning. And finally, because you're only inking one small area of the map, you are constantly using your weapon either to take the Splat Zone or to defeat an enemy. The essence of Splat Zone is pretty much identical to Turf War, except that it requires a lot more precision and coordinating. And the strategy is not only that some weapons are better at one thing than the other, but you can push back past the Splat Zone, keeping the enemy team from ever reaching it. And I think this is a very fun mode. It asks for more from the player. You have to put in more effort than in traditional Turf War. And that is the same as well with the other 3 modes. The second Anarchy mode is Tower Control. The goal this time is to ride a central tower to the checkpoint on the other end of the map. This is my personal favorite mode. It's also one of the most unique because the goal doesn't really have much to do with ink or killing the enemy. So in theory, you could technically beat this mode without ever shooting your weapon. But unless the opposing team just wanted you to win, that is never likely to happen. Like in Splat Zones, every player is targeting a singular point, but this time the point moves. And the direction in which it moves, I think, is the most important thing about this whole mode. The checkpoint that you are riding the tower to is closer to the enemy's spawn point than your spawn point, which means when you're in control of the tower, you are both at an advantage and a disadvantage. You're getting closer to the checkpoint, but at the same time the enemy is able to get to you quicker and quicker every time you defeat them. If you're not in control of the tower, you're at a disadvantage because the tower is moving closer and closer to the checkpoint that you don't want it to reach, but at the same time it's moving closer and closer to you, which means it's easier for you to catch up to the tower and take back control. In order to take control, your team has to have the majority of players on top of the tower, and when you're up there you are very exposed to the enemy. The way this game mode balances advantage and disadvantage, along with the usual safe state and risk state and risk versus reward, makes it my personal favorite. The next game mode is Rainmaker, which is capture the flag with a twist. The flag is a supersonic missile launcher, but it's insanely slow. This game mode is really similar to tower control. You are trying to move a central unit to a checkpoint closer to the enemy spawn, so a lot of the same stuff from tower control applies here, but this time, in order to take control of that central unit, the Rainmaker, you have to give up some mobility and your weapon, but the Rainmaker itself becomes your new weapon. I've never been in control of it long enough during a round to see how powerful it is, so I really don't know what it's capable of. But from my experience, unless you're insanely skilled with the weapon, it tends to be a downgrade from whatever weapon you were using. So whoever has the Rainmaker is putting themselves at a huge risk, because your location is almost always known by the enemy and you can't move as quickly, which means your team is who needs to help carry you to the checkpoint. So this mode has been designed to make teamwork a very crucial part of it. You cannot solo this mode at all. So with a good team, I could see this mode being a lot of fun. But at least for me, because this game mode focuses so heavy on teamwork, it tends to struggle a lot with just casual online play. It ends up being just a bunch of chaos, because no one knows who should grab the Rainmaker, and no one knows what to do after someone else grabs it. This mode has a lot of potential, and I'm sure in the right circumstance with the right team, it is a lot of fun. But at least when it comes to the way that I play Splatoon, this mode is not for me. The final mode is called Clam Blitz. This is kind of the odd one out of the bunch. It is weird. I understand where the idea for tower control, Splat Zones, and Rainmaker came from, but I have no idea what inspired them to make Clam Blitz. The goal is to explore the map and collect a bunch of golden clams. Once you collect so many, they turn into a football, the American kind. And then you throw that football at another ball, which turns that ball into a basket. And then you go back and collect more clams and throw those clams into the basket. I guess they wanted to combine American football with basketball. I do not know what the common consensus of this mode is, but I don't really like it. It's not a very easy mode to just pick up and play. There's a lot more to learn when you want to play this mode, and instead of adding one unique mechanic like Splat Zones that manages to flip everything on its head without really having to change anything just by adding a different goal, Clam Blitz adds a lot of different stuff. You have to keep track of how many clams you have, where clams spawn, how many clams it makes to take a football, and where the enemy basket is and how long it'll stay open before it closes. You also have to make sure you keep the opposing team away from your basket. So not only does this mode have a bunch of different mechanics, but there are a ton of different strategies you can take. Defensive and offensive and all of their variants. I feel like this mode changes the way this game feels the most. It is not a bad idea at all. I see where the charm and fun of this mode is, and it still uses the two core mechanics of platforming and shooting to its full advantage. It is Splatoon. It's just not for me. All of the Anarchy modes, or ranked modes, take the base of Turf War and build off of it a completely new game. Unlike Salmon Runs, which take place on completely different maps, unless you count big runs, all of the ranked modes take place on pre-existing maps. There are some minor changes made to the maps, but for the most part they stay the same. And because the ranked modes are all based much more heavily on skill than just going at it, they are the modes that most players prefer. In Turf War, you could play an insanely good game for almost the whole round, but if in the last 30 or 15 seconds the enemy gains the advantage on you, there's a chance they could pull out a win even though you dominated more than the majority of the game, because it is very easy to put out a lot of ink very quickly, and that's the goal of Turf War. But those late game turnarounds are not as easy to pull off during ranked modes, because they each have a set goal that takes time to pull off. You can't ride the tower to the other side of the map instantly, and you've got to wait for that timer to tick down on the Splat Zone. So in a sense, they are kind of more fair. They take into account all the work you've done the entire time. So even if the opposing team gains the advantage in the last few seconds, as long as you dominated the majority of the time, you will win. And so I think that's the real point of the ranked modes, beyond just being ranked They provide a place for players that have more skill to use that skill and actually get credit for it. They're all geniusly designed modes. And I have to admit, even if I don't like one or two of them, they still hold up to the standard that Splatoon has set. They take those two core elements of platforming and shooting and build more off of them. There are two things that I would like to see implemented in future Splatoon modes if we ever get new ones. I would like to see them take that balance of platforming and shooting and increase the platforming. The majority of modes in Splatoon increase the shooting aspect, like splat zones or tower control. I would like to see what a versus mode would look like if platforming was more of a focus. I have no idea what that would look like, it was just something I thought of while making this video. We have great platforming levels in the single player campaign, but I want to see what a more platforming based mode in versus mode would look like. The second thing I would like to see are different types of Splatfest. Splatoon 3 introduced the Tricolor Splatfest, which is a genius idea, and they've managed to balance it out. Everything that applies to normal Turf War that makes that mode so great works with Tricolor. I want to see a Tricolor Splat Zone or a Tricolor Tower Control. I'm not exactly sure how well those modes would hold up in Tricolor, but if nothing else, the Splatoon team has shown that there are limitless possibilities for what will work in a Splatoon type game. Let's just hope they keep making them. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope I did an okay job of breaking down the extra Splatoon modes like I did in the previous video. Let me know what your favorite Splatoon mode is down in the comments, along with your thoughts on everything I've said, and if a part 3 is going to be necessary. Thank you for watching.